Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This week is the Parsha of Bamidbar. So in the past few weeks, we have been talking about the notion of counting as it relates to the Sfiras HaOmer, counting days, counting time. Today, we will continue on the theme of counting, but as it relates to people. Of course, the Parsha of Bamidbar, it opens up with the census, the counting of the Jewish people. It is the second month of the Jewish calendar, the month of Iyar, and the first day, Aleph Iyar, and at this point, they are counted. Now, it is brought down in the halacha that every single year, prior to Shavuos, we always read the Parsha of Bamidbar, whether it's the week immediately before Shavuot, whereas in this case, it is the week prior. Shavuos is next week, but we don't read the Parsha of Naso either way because Shavuot is on Shabbos. So there's obviously a thematic connection between the Parsha of Bamidbar to Shavuos, to the day of Matan Torah, the receiving of the Torah. Now, the word Bamidbar literally means in the desert, as all the events that transpire from when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim till they enter Eretz Yisrael take place in these parshiot. And there is a thematic connection between the desert and the Torah, as in the Talmud and other sources, there are many associations between a desert. One of them, briefly, is that a desert is ownerless. There's nobody living there. It's not. There's nobody that's living there, and so too, the Torah. Many people look at the Torah as being related or associated with a specific group, or perspective, or philosophy in life. And ultimately, we need to know, as a preparation for the Torah, if someone feels that they're boxed out from receiving the Torah, they're not going to feel that they can truly study and internalize the messages of the Torah. And therefore, Bamidbar, we read that we're supposed to reflect on the concept of Bamidbar, that the Torah is truly ownerless in the sense that no one has a monopoly. Anybody can truly, through study and prayer and reflection, can make the Torah their own, not to the exclusion of anybody else. But that's the connection of Bamidbar as a desert. But we know that the Chumash of Bamidbar is known as the Chumash HaPikudim. It's the book of Numbers. And therefore, if there is a connection of Bamidbar to Matan Torah, it's not merely in the fact that there is a desert, but in the fact that it is a book of numbers. There must be a relationship, an association of counting and a census to the special time of the Torah. And indeed, Rashi, when he talks about the census, he says that at this point, Hashem counts the Jewish people. He counts them often because, in his words, mitochi basam, there's an affection, an endearment that Hashem exhibits to the Bnei Yisrael through counting them. And at this point, when Hashem is going to rest Hashchina, at this point, this is a month after the Mishkan was erected and all of the rites and rituals were set up for the Mishkan. So at this point, Hashem counts the Bnei Yisrael. So it seems that the connection of the counting at this point is because the Shechina is resting. And we need to understand this. What's going on over here? Why are we counting the Bnei Yisrael specifically at this point? And the truth is that Hashem counted the Bnei Yisrael several times, and most recently, a half a year, as recent as a half a year prior, after the Jewish people served the golden calf, the Chet Egel, and then there was a plague. So in the Parsha of Kisisa, we read about how there was the census. Hashem counts the Bnei Yisrael. So what changed? Why within a half a year the statistics didn't change in any significant or considerable way? Why count the Bnei Yisrael again? And in general, what's the point of counting the Yidden? Hashem knows how many Jewish people there are before the count and after the count. What exactly is achieved by this counting? And we need to understand, in general, this concept of counting the Jewish people to this point in the year, as it relates to Matan Torah. So there is a notion that's brought down in some of the commentators. Ramban, Nachmanides talks about it, how we see what was unique about this counting in the words of the Torah, that the counting was legulgalosam. They counted the heads. That is to say, they counted every single individual. It wasn't merely that they came up to a certain family or a tribe and they say, "Tell us, how many do you have here, and give us a number. How many households, how many members?" And through this, they tallied every single one. Which the Ramban says, we see from here how Hashem treasures the contribution of every single individual to the building of the Mishkan, and that's why they are counted here at this point. So what we have here is an interesting paradox, because when it comes to counting, you have two perspectives, you have two facets to the census. On the one hand, we count every single individual, right? As the Ramban says, we treasure and we cherish every single person, and we count them as part of this general census. On the other hand, we count every single person only once, whether it's Moshe Rabbeinu, whether it was Yehoshua, every single Jew only counts as one. So at the end of the day, when you get the tally, as the tally here from the number of male participants from the age of 20 to 60, you had over 603,000 people who joined. This was only, when you count every single person just counts as one. So you couldn't really tell from the number who was significant, who was special, because every single person only counted as one. And the truth is, in life we have this paradox. There's two ways at looking at people, looking at individuals. On the one hand, we have the concept of the tzibur, of the collective. We look at communities, especially now with every single day we get these updates, statistics, how many people contracted the illness, and how many cases there are. We sort of look at the conglomerate. We look at the collective. Throughout history, we had many people who contended that the individual isn't necessarily so important so much as the social collective whole. In its most extreme form, you have the Marxist socialist perspective, where every single individual sort of is one cog, is one piece in just one great machinery that's marching towards a certain purpose or a certain goal. And in this case, the individual is not so important. Of course, socialism, in its extreme, it devolves into communism, where the individual is entirely obliterated. On the other hand, we look at people as individuals. Capitalism, it's all about the individual, your contribution. It's about yourself and your contribution to life and to your goals and achievements. So we look at a crowd of people and the individual gets swallowed up, or do we look at the individual as an individual? So what is the Torah perspective? What is the value of an individual vis-a-vis the community? And we have sources that seem to indicate both are important and both are valid. On the one hand, our tradition tells us that every single person has to say, Bishvili nivra olam, the world was created for me. As the Talmud tells us that every single person is considered an entire world. As we see that Adam Harishon was created alone to teach us the value and the significance of every single individual. To the extent that if, God forbid, one person kills another person, it's as if they have destroyed the entire world. And conversely, if one person saves another, it is as if he has saved an entire world. So we see how valuable and how significant an individual is. That's on one side of the coin. On the other hand, we know that there's a value not just to individuals, there's a value to community. Especially today, how much we appreciate and we long for the days when we had the community, the communal life being in shul. There's the concept of a minyan, of the quorum of people that we come together and we constitute a new entity through which we're able to engage in all kinds of davening, which we can't do now, davar shebekdusha, whether we're saying Kaddish, whether we're saying Kedusha, Baruch Hu, reading the Torah. There are many, many things that as individuals, as each piece on its own, are not able to do anything significant in that sense. We have to sit alone in the home and daven alone, and we very much feel the lack of community. So tzibur, so community, the collective, is clearly a very, very important piece. But the question is, how do these two concepts, how do these two notions, how do they coexist in a harmonious way? Because ultimately, when you have the yachid, when you have the tzibur, when you have the individual and the collective, oftentimes these values, they compete with each other, and one seemingly cannot coexist with the other. Today, when they talk about the virus, we talk about the challenges that we deal with going ahead. There are many considerations when they talk about opening up, or even beforehand when they were shutting things down. It always came down to certain calculations that there's a tremendous cost of society being open and free. There are certain individuals or members of society who will contract the illness, and what it would appear to be that for many, many people, although the virus would be dangerous, for many, many people it won't be such a big deal. It is merely that we are protecting a few vulnerable, the vulnerable and the compromised, those with compromised health. On the other hand, and therefore, many said we need to shut down society, the economy. Everyone has to stay home to protect those individuals. But many have contended that the price that we pay is exorbitant, and in a certain sense, there's far more people who are suffering at the expense of helping a small number of individuals comparatively. That is to say, the economic cost, and further, even the mental health and the well-being of many, many people who are sacrificing for a few people, it does not seem just. And oftentimes we have that question when you have the collective, the tzibur, and many times in halacha we find this as it's a fact of life in halacha that the tzibur, the good, the greater good, the good of the community, should in certain instances override the importance of the needs of certain individuals. And the truth is, we find this in Matan Torah as well. As we prepare for the Yom Tov of Shavuos next week, we see this concept. Our tradition tells us that prior to when Hashem gave us the Torah, every single Jew was present throughout history. The neshamos who were in subsequent generations would come down to this world. They were there too. Every single Jew was present at Maimed Har Sinai, at the foot of Har Sinai. And it says, the Midrash tells us that if one Jew would be missing, we would not be able to receive the Torah. So thus, every single Jew is indispensable. Every single Jew is important. But that's the way we see the Jewish people as a whole. As the Torah tells us, Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Har, that when they arrived into the Midbar Sinai and they encamped by the mountain, they were all Vayichan. There was even though it was many Jewish people, there were many millions of people. Vayichan, which has the singular term, and which implies that there was only one person. Our commentators say that there was a unity, there was a connection, that every single Jew identified as one at the foot of the mountain. And thus, they received the Torah as a collective, as a whole, where not one single Jewish person could be missing. So that's how we see it on one side of the coin. On the other hand, we know that every single Jew is important and unique. We know when it comes to a Sefer Torah, our tradition tells us that the Torah is made of many hundreds of thousands of letters. And if one letter is missing, then the Sefer Torah is invalid. So that teaches us that every single letter is important, every single Jew. As our tradition tells us that every single Jew has a corresponding letter in the Torah. But on the other hand, it's not enough just to have all the letters of the Torah. The halacha tells us that each letter needs to be encompassed, needs to be surrounded by the white of the parchment. You cannot have even two letters touching each other. If they are, the Sefer Torah as well will be invalidated. As in the words of the halacha, has to be mukav gvil. Each letter needs to be encompassed, needs to be surrounded entirely from all four sides with the white parchment, which this halacha indicates not just how each letter is indispensable as part of a whole, but in fact, each letter needs to be unique. It needs to be distinguished from the other. And if we cannot differentiate one letter from the other, that as well will invalidate it. So this speaks to the individuality, to the significance of each unique person. So how do we reconcile the two? How do we look at every single person, every single Jew, as a cog in this wheel, just being one little piece, but yet to maintain its individuality? There's an interesting custom that the Rebbe that the Rebbe pushed in the 1980s when it came to the Yom Tov of Shavuos. He urged and very much encouraged his Hasidim to ensure that when it comes to Aseres HaDibros, to listening to the Torah, the Rebbe was very much encouraging his Hasidim to ensure that every single person should come and listen to the Torah, even little children, especially little children. The Rebbe said we should do all that we can to make sure that they participate to listening to the Aseres HaDibros. And even little children, even if they're infants. And the Rebbe mentioned the famous Gemara that's brought in Pirkei Avos about Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, that when he was very young, when he was an infant, his mother would schlep his crib to the Beis Medrash, and he would listen to the Torah. And they said, "What are you doing? This is this kid. This is a little infant. He doesn't understand anything. Doesn't hear anything." But it had a very, very profound impact on him later in his life, to the extent that in the Pirkei Avos, when they praise Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, what do they say? Ashri Yeladatei. They praise the fact that the person who gave birth to him, because already from a very, very young age, it was inculcated within him a love and a passion for Torah and mitzvahs. So the Rebbe says, if this was the case by Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya when he was younger, we find even earlier when the fetus is still in the womb. Our tradition tells us, the Talmud says that an angel studies Torah with the fetus throughout the duration throughout the pregnancy, and it is when it leaves, it gives it a slap on the mouth, and it forgets the entire Torah. And yet it's still important, even though subsequently when the person is born, they have forgotten all the Torah, it still retains some residual, some vestige of memories of the studying of Torah. So certainly when a baby is born, to come and hear the Aseres HaDibros, the Rebbe says this is especially important. But why? Why make sure that every single infant and baby and child comes to hear Aseres HaDibros? The Rebbe said because, of course, there's the Medrash that says that they were the guarantors when Hashem was looking for someone to ensure that the Torah will be studied, and they presented all sorts of collateral. They said we have our elders, we have the prophets, we have the scholars. Hashem didn't want all of them. It was only when they presented the children, Hashem said, "I want them along." So that's, of course, they are the guarantors. They are those that will guarantee the eternity of the Torah. But the Rebbe said another point. He says that when it came to Har Sinai, as we mentioned before, every single Jew was present. Everyone had to be present when Hashem gave us the Torah. So if so, when we read the Aseres HaDibros every single year, we need to reenact, we need to relive Ma'amid Har Sinai, the Sinaitic event. If so, we need to have the children there, because if we don't have the children, then it's missing. As we mentioned before, if one Jew was lacking, was not present, the entire Matan Torah couldn't take place. So, on the one hand, every single person is unique because they contribute to the totality. A tzibur, a collective, is important because there are many, many important pieces to the puzzle. And each one contributes to the totality. They tell the story about many years ago in I believe in Syria, that there was these few Islamic friends. They were sitting, and against their holy tradition, they were drinking some alcoholic beverages, and one of them drank a little too much. Maybe he wasn't used to drinking, and he comes home and he's drunk, and he goes over to his wife and he says, "I need you right now to make me a nice, strong Turkish coffee." So his wife says, "Okay, I need to put up the pot. I need to put up put the coffee together. It's going to take some time." But he's getting mad and he's drunk, and he says, "If you don't, I'm going to right now, there's this cake sitting on the table. If my coffee is not ready by the time I finish my cake, I will divorce you." And he starts gobbling down the cake. But of course, it took time to put up the fire and to boil the water and to make the coffee. And by the time she finished making the coffee, she comes to the table and he has already gobbled up the entire cake. And he said, "Wife, you are divorced." And he walks out, which according to the Muslim tradition, they don't need no get, they don't need no contract. Just by the words, they utter the words, and it's a done deal. He wakes up in the morning and he has some vague recollection of the events that transpired the previous day, and he's full of regret and remorse. He goes to his kadi, he goes to his authority, and they're trying to find a psaheter, some way to wiggle out of it, but there's nothing they could do. Of course, what do? They need to go to the rabbi. The rabbi is able to figure out some kind of loophole, some way out of it. So they go to the chacham and they ask him, "What should we do?" So he says, "Come with me. Let's go back to your house." He goes with this Muslim guy. He goes back to their house and he sees his wife there. He says, "I need you to boil up a cup of hot Turkish coffee." She boils it up and prepares it, brings it to him. He says, goes into the room. He says, "Where were you eating the cake?" He says, "Right here." He shows him the table. He goes to the table. He says, "I want you to bend down and pick up." You see, there's still a few crumbs underneath the table. So he bends down. He picks up a few crumbs. He says, "Here's your coffee. Here's your cake. Drink your coffee, eat your cake, and now you could have your wife too." So we see over here that sometimes we look at a piece of cake and it looks like a big cake. But ultimately, the cake is made up of crumbs. It's made up of little pieces. And on its own, they look insignificant, but together they constitute one big, delicious cake. So that is the way we could look at the tzibur. We could look at the collective, how it's made up of many, many individuals. But on the other hand, we know that it's not just enough to look at the collective, because as we mentioned before, indeed, the tzibur may be made up of details, may be made up of individuals. But what about when the values of the tzibur, when the values of the collective compete with that of the individual? We have a famous halacha in Rambam that in an instance where, God forbid, people come to a group of Jews and say, "You need to surrender this specific Jew, or else we will kill all of you." Halacha says it is forbidden to surrender, to give up, to hand over this individual, even if that means an entire group will be killed. And you'll say that they're going to kill them anyways. It is forbidden to give up even one Jew. We're not going to get into too much into the halachic discussions about this, which is a discussion in itself in terms of the ethical and the ethical imperative in this situation. But what this teaches us, the value and the infinity of a single individual, that even when it comes to competing, the tzibur and the yachid, you have many, many people. You'll say, hang on a second. If one person is important, certainly many, many people are important. How can we sacrifice an entire group of people for one person? Because a single person is infinite, of infinite value. And therefore, when we look at the individual, we don't just look at how they make up how they're part of the tzibur, we actually look at the yachid, we look at an individual as an individual. So when a person will say, who am I? I'm not important. There's Moshe Rabbeinu, there's some great, great Jewish people throughout history. They made tremendous contributions for many, many generations. But I am a simple person. I am a nobody. Who am I? And this is an important exercise before receiving the Torah. Because the Torah tells us, when Hashem gave us the Torah, He said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. Hashem didn't say, Anochi Hashem Elokechem. He didn't say, I am the God, and it would seem He should say Elokechem, because there were many, many Jews. He should have said, I am your God in a plural sense. But He says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Lashon Yachid, in a singular sense. And there's many explanations to this, but one of them is, it teaches us the power of the individual. Hashem looks at every single person, and a person should realize that Hashem looks at every single individual. We shouldn't just see ourselves as one piece in a bigger in a bigger sea of a community, of a congregation, which we are that, indeed. But we are also an individual as an individual. And when we see ourselves as such, and we see ourselves the way Hashem sees us, that empowers us to realize that each and every one of us have an indispensable contribution. And there's a specific mission that we have. And therefore, even if we don't feel important, we should try to see ourselves the way Hashem sees us. They tell a story about a famous conductor, an Italian conductor. His name was Arturo Toscanini. He was a very, very famous Italian conductor who lived some years ago. He was known for his brilliant compositions, his amazing photographic memory, and he was once being interviewed by a biographer who was going to write a whole book. And once this biographer calls him up and says, I'm going to be in town, I wanted to ask you a few questions. And this conductor, Arturo, says, I'm sorry, I'm very, very busy tonight. I'm not available. He says, why is that? He says, well, tonight there is a special concert that's taking place overseas, and I'm not able to be there, but I want to listen over the radio. And when I listen to an orchestra, to a symphony, it has to be absolutely silent. There could be no distractions. There could be nothing at all. I'm sorry, I'm not available. So the biographer is very much intrigued, and he says, okay, listen, perhaps we don't have to talk, we don't have to have any kind of dialogue, but for me to watch you listen to this, you're such an amazing, important, historical composer and conductor, it would be an honor and a privilege if I could just merely observe you listen. Do you mind if I come? I'll sit next to you. I'm not going to say a word. I'm not going to move an inch. So he said, okay, come to me tomorrow night, and you could watch me. You could observe me. Comes the next night, and he's listening, and this reporter, this journalist is watching him for an hour. He doesn't move a muscle, and he's listening to every note of the orchestra, and it sounds amazing. After an hour, the orchestra, it concludes, and the journalist turns to Arturo. He says, wow, that was pretty amazing. What do you think about it? He said, well, it was nice, but it wasn't so great. He says, what do you mean it wasn't so great? To me, it sounded amazing. He says, well, I know that this was a 120-piece orchestra, but I was able to tell that there was one violinist was missing. He says, how could you even tell that? How could you even know? The next day, this journalist, he calls up the orchestra, the conductor overseas, and he says, tell me about your orchestra last night. How many people were there? He says, well, it's interesting you ask that because there were supposed to be 120 members. There were supposed to be 15 violinists, but only 14 showed up. So then he goes over to Arturo. He says, Arturo, I don't understand. How are you able to determine that there was somebody missing? Here you are, thousands of miles away. You're listening on a radio. You could tell that there is one violin. How would you know if there's 14 violinists, 15 violinists? To me, it sounds all the same. So the Italian conductor says, listen, there's a difference between me and you. You are merely a member of the audience. You listen to the music, you enjoy it, it's beautiful, it's interesting for you. That is all from your perspective, because you don't know better. So you hear whatever you hear, you could enjoy it, and it's great. You see, I am the composer. I put this composition together, so I know every single note. I know what belongs, I know what doesn't belong. And therefore, when there is one note, when there is one violinist missing, I can tell. Indeed, many of us, we go through our lives and we may feel that our lives aren't so remarkable. We feel that we're living a mediocre, average life. We don't think that there's any special talents that we have. We don't have any special ambitions. And many could question, what is the point? What is the point of all of this? We're getting ready to receive the Torah. Who am I to receive the Torah? Who am I to think that I'm anybody special? Hashem is telling us that from our perspective as an individual, we may feel inadequate. But Hashem, He's the composer. He knows, even though you may not be Moshe Rabbeinu, if you don't study Torah, if you don't observe a certain mitzvah, you may feel, big deal, it's missing. Hashem feels, Hashem knows that your contribution is important. Because Hashem doesn't create anything for nothing. If He didn't need you, you wouldn't have been created. The fact that He made you, the fact that He created you means He needs your contribution. And to Him, He knows exactly what it's for. And more importantly, when it's missing, He notices. And we need to internalize that perspective. And there is the importance of the counting of the Jewish people. We asked before Hashem, seemingly He knows. He knows when He counts, even before He knows the census, He knows what the tallies are, He knows what the numbers are going to be. The idea of counting is to stimulate, it is to activate the potential, the unique talents that each and every one of us have. When Hashem counts us, He's saying is, you matter. You're important. I know that, Hashem says, but I need you to know that. I need you to realize that I cherish and value you for who you are. Not just because you're just another member of the community, another person on the community list that we're going to call up and ask when we do our Hatzalah drive, when we do this campaign, or when we need a minyan, we're going to call you, but I need you because I need you. Not just the way you contribute to others, I need your special individual contribution to the totality, to the purpose of creation. And without you, it cannot happen. I was watching this interview that the rabbi from South Africa, his name is Rabbi David Lapin. He had an interesting story that he related. As growing up, studying, he began studying for the rabbinate. He had an interesting situation where he decided to maintain his intellectual independence, not to be beholden to anyone. He decided that even after he became a rabbi, he wanted his income not to be dependent on others, and therefore he would have to subordinate his opinion to others. Rather, he wanted to be self-sufficient, and he went into commodities trading. He had his own business. He had his own livelihood. But over time, he had a challenge because here he's teaching, and he had this academy teaching many, many people, and he has the rabbinate with all of its duties and responsibilities. But on the other hand, he's also a businessman. He's running an entire business. And in his words, it was running 2 full-time jobs. And at some point, something had to give. He says it was taking a tremendous toll on his family, and he needed guidance. He needed to figure out which way should he give up the rabbinate? Should he give up his business? What should he do? It was in the 1970s, and he's going to New York. He decides he wants to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Comes to 770, and he doesn't know that he has to make an appointment months in advance. And he's told, you don't just walk in and get a yechidus, a private audience with the Rebbe. So he writes in, he says, listen, my conundrum here is not just about my own private life. I have questions of a dilemma that's relevant to many, many Jewish people. It's for the klal, it's for the tzibur, it's for the collective. And it is agreed he's to see the Rebbe. He goes into the Rebbe, he says. He thought it would be just a short, symbolic encounter, but the Rebbe the Rebbe gets up, tells him to sit down, and he said he's there for 15 minutes. And he says he lays out to the Rebbe his dilemma, his questions. What should he do? He has the community, he has to teach, but he also has his income, and he doesn't know how to navigate. He doesn't know how to juggle these two. He thought the Rebbe, of course, what's the Rebbe going to say? Give up one, maybe give up the business. But in the Rebbe's inimitable way, there is no giving up anything. The Rebbe says you should not give up your rabbanos. You should not give up your source of income. You should actually keep both. And of course, you got to add. The Rebbe said that, of course, there's the rabbinate. You're the makarev, you're teaching people, you're inspiring people. But even in your business, it's a unique opportunity. You could reach people in a way that you couldn't as being a rabbi, and it's a tremendous kiddush Hashem, and therefore it's a valuable tool in kiruv, in bringing people closer. And therefore you need to not just maintain these two streams in life, but you actually should increase. And this was not the answer that he was expecting, and he says, Rebbe, it's very nice and everything, but it's just not realistic. I can't do it. As he says, I'm already up to here. How am I able to maintain that and increase? It's just too much. And the Rebbe told him a very, very powerful idea. The Rebbe said, you know what your problem is? Your problem is that you think that human beings are like chemicals, like a chemical reaction. In a chemical reaction, what you have is you have two chemicals, you have these two entities that when they come together, it creates a reaction, which in turn creates a third entity. So you have the two chemicals, and it creates a third entity. He says the truth is, human beings are totally different. What a human reaction is, not a chemical reaction, it is a nuclear reaction. And that means the nuclear reaction happens at the core of the person. It starts at the center, but then it begins to radiate in a spherical way, not in a linear way from one person to the other, but there is this circle, there is this ring. And when you make a connection with a person. It could be just for a second, just for a moment. But what happens is you connect at the core, at the essence of the person, and that creates a nuclear reaction. And that begins to radiate outwards. But what happens is, as it continues to grow, it's not just from one person to another person. It is this circular, this spherical reaction which continues to get bigger. And as it grows greater and greater, so does its impact, so does its influence. And he's reflecting, he's saying, this really struck a chord with him, especially with some of the psychology that he was reading about, where the psychology at that time was saying that one person, when they have a certain mood or a certain energy or feeling, it can impact three people. So he said to himself, he came to realize that when he is connecting, he's interacting with people, it's not just him and that person. He's studying Torah with that person, he impacts that person. If it's a nuclear reaction, that means when he's sitting and giving a shiur to 20 people, he's not just impacting 20 people, he is impacting 60 people. And therefore, he came to realize the studying of the teachings, his rabbinate, and his business, he was impacting thousands and thousands of people. What the Rebbe was teaching him, that his value, his contribution, wasn't just whatever he did, that was his contribution. Since it's not a chemical reaction, it's a nuclear reaction. When you impact one person, you're not just impacting that person, you're impacting their family. And when their family is impacted, that in turn impacts that family. The Rebbe is giving us a very, very powerful insight into our abilities, into our capabilities. An individual is not just an individual. Indeed, an individual is the community. Every single person, as the Talmud says, is an olam maleh. Because when we connect with our deepest strength, with our deepest power, we are in turn not just impacting that one person that we encounter. We change their lives, we change their family in turn changes those around them. Each person thus has an incredible, unbelievable power. And therefore, when we are counted, when we have this counting, as the Torah tells us, counting every single Jew, this unleashes the nuclear power that each and every single one of us possess. So, what we have from here is, indeed there is a community, indeed there is a power, but it is the individual. The tzibur is made up of those individuals, and it is the individuals through this that they are counted. As we know, the famous story of the Rebbe when he was giving out dollars, and this woman comes across the Rebbe and says, "Rebbe, you're standing for so many hours, and you're not getting tired. How is it that you're not getting tired? I'm standing online for an hour. I'm tired. You are standing for so many hours, and you're engaging with each person. How could you not be tired?" And the Rebbe famously said, when a person is counting diamonds, you don't get tired. Now, on one level, it's a beautiful story, how the Rebbe how much he loves every single Jew. He sees how they're diamonds in his eyes, and he doesn't get tired. Just like a person, if they're counting diamonds, they don't get tired. But also, seemingly, what the story is also teaching us, it's not just how the Rebbe loves. It's not just about the Rebbe's Avos Yisrael for every single Jew. The story is also telling us how the Rebbe sees the diamond in every single Jew. He looks at so many people passing by, and it's not just then, it's also now. Whether when we go to the Rebbe's oil and we daven there, or even wherever we are, when we connect to the Rebbe counts every single Jew. It's not just that he has the Avos Yisrael and he could love every single person, he doesn't get tired. But it's the fact that he sees every Jew as a diamond, and his effort, his drive throughout his life was to show each and every one of us how we are that diamond, for us to see it. The Rebbe sees it, that is obvious, that is clear. But that we should come to realize that we are that diamond. So the Rebbe giving out the dollar to every single Jew that passes by is like Hashem counting every Jew, which means it is there to reveal the diamond, to reveal the nuclear power that each and every single one of us have. And when we are counted, when that diamond in us is revealed, then nothing can stop us. There is nothing that we don't set our mind to that we cannot accomplish. We have now come to realize it's not just the Moshe Rabbeinus, it's not just the great people who accomplish great things. Each and every one of us is capable and worthy of going to Har Sinai, receiving the Torah. And that's why if a single Jew is missing, the Torah could not be given. Because indeed, every single Jew is a nuclear, infinite, powerful person that has so much to contribute to their families, to their friends, to the world at large. This is something that we get from the Rebbe. The Rebbe taught us this special perspective. To be able, on the one hand, the Rebbe as a Rebbe, he himself was a private person, but he was a Rebbe for all of the Hasidim. And when he would teach, on the one hand, he would see the entire community, Jews, non-Jews, people from all walks of life. He sees the tzibur, he sees the whole collective. But on the other hand, he doesn't lose sight, he doesn't lose perspective of the single individual. Every single individual still remains important. He doesn't forget any person, doesn't forget their story, doesn't forget their history. He sees it all. I was reading an article where someone observes how a very fascinating thing that the Rebbe, he of course, as great as he was, he had tremendous expectations from every single person to realize their potential, as we said before, in the story of that rabbi, that wasn't just enough that he maintained his rabbinate and his business. The Rebbe expected him to do more. But on the other hand, as much as the Rebbe pushed and motivated a person to do more, he didn't ask more than they were capable of. Every person was based on their level, based on their individuality. He brings an example where he shows that the Rebbe wrote, on the same day, he wrote 2 letters to a chassan on the exact same day, but the response, but each letter was catered specifically to that individual chassan. One of them, the Rebbe says how he received the letter, how when it came to his chasana, this chassan, he recited a few lines of his mimer of Chassidus, as is customary. Chassidim on the day of their wedding, they recite a special mimer that was given over by the Rabbeim. And the Rebbe says he was surprised that this chassan, he only said a few lines of the mimer. Certainly he should know the value, how special and important it is that the entire mimer should be recited on the day of the chasana. And the Rebbe says what was done, but as soon as it's possible, this chassan, he should recite the entire mimer. And on the same day, to another chassan, the Rebbe writes that wishing Mazel Tov for the wedding, and he says it is also customary, and if possible, to say a few lines of the mimer that is traditionally recited on the day of one's chasana. So the Rebbe, as much as he sees all of the Chassidim and he elevates them, he brings out each person's potential, he doesn't lose sight of what the capability is. The Rebbe, for someone who is a chassan, who grew up with Chassidus, or is at least able to appreciate and identifies very much to the extent that the Rebbe says, I want you to recite the entire mimer on the day of your wedding. But to this other person, it's the same day. The Rebbe nevertheless has a sensitivity to appreciate this person clearly is not in a position, and it is not to be expected of, to recite the entire mimer, but at least a few psukim, a few verses, a few lines from the mimer. So in summation, what we have here, as we started out from the beginning, we asked, what is the connection between Bamidbar, the counting, the census of the Jewish people in Matan Torah? And in short, what we have here is, on the one hand, when we count, we are counting every single Jew equally. When you have the final tally, Moshe Rabbeinu, Yehoshua, whoever they're counting at that time does not count any more than the water carrier, than the wood chopper. The wood chopper doesn't count any less. They are all count as one. So the counting, on the one hand, highlights, it underscores the commonality, the common denominator we all have with each other. But we also count individuals. We count every single person. Yes, I may not be Moshe Rabbeinu, I may not be a leader, but I am special. We are all special. Each and every one of us. Hashem says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am your God. It was just for you, B'shvili nivra olam, but for me, the world was created. I am an entire world. I am an olam maleh. And therefore, we count the Jew to activate, to be able to realize that potential, to realize the nuclear power that each and every one of us have. And when we realize that potential, we receive the Torah, it becomes a whole new experience. We are able to realize that every mitzvah that we do is important. Hashem knows the value. We may not appreciate, but Hashem knows it. And through this knowledge, this empowers us to do all that we need to do. And may Hashem give each and every one of us the brachas that we need for health and parnasa and nachas, physically and spiritually. May we merit the coming of Mashiach. B'mheira v'yameinu. Amen.